chosen to learn more about Hernando de Soto. Let's review. What have you learned so far? How did Columbus and Ponce de Leon treat the Native Americans? Well, if you remember correctly, they did not treat them well at all. In fact, they took many of them as slaves. What is the Spanish word for conqueror? It is conquistador. What is colonization? Colonization is the process of developing a settlement in an area and taking control of the land and the people who live there. Was Ponce de Leon's colonization of Florida successful? Why or why not? It was not successful because as they were setting up their colony, they were attacked by the Calusa Indians. All right, we're going to look at this map and we're going to talk about some of the places that Juan Ponce de Leon explored and visited. All right, so Ponce de Leon visited and explored mostly in this area right here and around the Caribbean. He visited and explored places like the West Indies. This is what it was called back then, here in the Caribbean Sea. He went to Puerto Rico, Cuba, Florida right here, and around the Gulf of Mexico. All right, new vocabulary. Demoralized means to be weakened in courage or confidence or spirit. So if somebody says something bad about you and says you can't do it, then you might feel demoralized. Disastrous refers to something that causes great suffering or loss. Makeshift refers to something that is temporary and often of poor quality. So if you look at this boat, does that boat look very comfortable or strong? I don't think that boat would last very long at all. A mutiny is a refusal to follow or obey the rules and orders of the person in charge. It's a rebellion. The example here is, after days of being lost at sea with food supplies decreasing, the ship's crew organized a mutiny against the captain. Outposts are military stations that are some distance away from the main base. A party is a group of people brought together for a specific purpose or a specific person. Scouting is to explore or search for something. Stranded means to be left in a place without a way to easily leave. All right, today you will be learning about a conquistador named Hernando de Soto. Before embarking on his own expedition, de Soto traveled to the New World with a fellow conquistador in South America, Francisco Pizarro, and learned from him. Listen carefully to learn about Hernando de Soto's expedition and his discoveries. Make a prediction why de Soto went on an expedition and where he went. Hernando de Soto. On May 30th, 1539, the veteran conquistador Hernando de Soto led a group of Spaniards ashore on the western coast of Florida. De Soto staked a flagpole into the sandy beach and claimed the land for the King of Spain. De Soto was not the first Spaniard to explore Florida. Juan Ponce de Leon had explored the area in 1513 and again in 1521, but he had failed in his attempt to establish a permanent Spanish colony in Florida. Another Spaniard, Panfilo de Narvaez, had tried to conquer Florida but did not succeed. Narvaez landed on the west coast of Florida in 1527 with 600 men. He and his men marched inland in search of gold. They attacked the natives and were attacked by them in return. Many Spaniards were killed. After experiencing little progress, Narvaez and his men decided to make their way to the Gulf Coast to Spanish outposts in Mexico. They hurriedly constructed makeshift boats to sail along the coast. Many of the men died of dehydration on this voyage. Some of the boats drifted off, and the men on them were never heard from again. Just when Narvaez and his men thought things could not get any worse, a hurricane hit, sinking their boats, drowning many of the men and leaving the few survivors stranded on a beach near present-day Galveston, Texas. In the end of the six, in the end of the 600 men who set off on the voyage, only 4 men managed to get back to Mexico alive to tell the tale. Hernando de Soto knew about the explorations of Ponce de Leon and Narvaez. He knew it would be dangerous to explore Florida, but he felt he could achieve more than the men who had explored before him. After all, de Soto had been in Peru with Francisco Pizarro, one of the most successful of all the conquistadors, when Pizarro captured the Inca Emperor Atahualpa. De Soto had helped collect the great ransom of silver and gold that made Pizarro very rich, and De Soto, too, became a very wealthy man through his relationship with Pizarro. Hernando de Soto believed he could make even more money by conquering Florida and gathering up the gold that was rumored to be there. De Soto invested much of his own money in his Florida expedition, and he prepared for it carefully. De Soto signed up lots of other experts, including soldiers, sailors, tailors, shoemakers, engineers, and priests. Most of the 700 men on his expedition were Spaniards, but there were a number of recruits from other countries in Europe. The expedition sailed from Spain in April of 1538. After a year in Cuba, De Soto and his men sailed to Florida, arriving at the end of May in 1539. De Soto sent a scouting party inland and discovered an abandoned Indian village. Finding abandoned Indian villages was not unusual. By this time, many native people had learned that the arrival of Spaniards was usually not good news. Many chiefs decided the safest course of action was to abandon their villages. That way, they could avoid the Spanish. Sometimes the Indians would return to the village later after the Spanish had moved away. De Soto and his men established a base in the abandoned village and began to explore the surrounding land. They made a remarkable discovery on their exploration. They found a Spaniard who had been living among the natives and had learned a little of their language. His name was Juan Ortiz, and he had been a member of the disastrous Narvaez expedition. Juan Ortiz had been treated cruelly by one Native American chieftain and was later adopted by another tribe. The Spanish were astonished to find him living like a native. Native Americans would sometimes adopt outsiders, including Europeans, into their tribes, even though their experience taught them that Europeans were interested in conquering their lands. The Spanish listened to his stories and made Ortiz one of their translators. De Soto left some men near the coast and took some other men to explore inland. He and his men made their way through swamps and forests. They found more deserted villages and helped themselves to whatever food and supplies were left behind. Some of the natives attacked the Spaniards as they marched. They would ambush or attack De Soto and his men in the swamps, and then run away. De Soto fought back. To discourage others from attacking, De Soto's strategy was to be vicious early on. That way, De Soto thought, word would get around that he and his men were not worth attacking, and that might actually save more of his men in the end. As De Soto moved inland, he would frequently take natives as prisoners to use them as guides in the new land. By mid-September, De Soto and his men arrived at a village called Napatuca. The local chief, Vitachuco, seemed friendly, but Juan Ortiz told De Soto that this friendliness might be an act. Ortiz had heard rumors that Vitachuco was plotting against De Soto. De Soto decided to take no chances. He attacked the people of Napatuca and took Vitachuco prisoner. Even though he was a prisoner, Vitachuco wasn't treated as poorly as other prisoners. He was allowed to keep some of his servants and often ate with De Soto. De Soto thought if he kept the chief in comfortable surroundings, Vitachuco and his people would cooperate with him. This strategy seemed to be working. Until one night, Vitachuco and his people attacked. The Spaniards eventually won this battle and killed Vitachuco. After this incident, the Spaniards marched further north into Florida. A native De Soto took earlier as a prisoner told them of a city to the north in what is now South Carolina called Cofetachequi, where the chief was a woman who had lots of gold and pearls. De Soto and his men marched on, passing through what is now Georgia into what is now north central South Carolina. There they met La Senora de Cofetachequi, the Lady of Cofetachequi. At first, the Lady of Cofetachequi was friendly, allowing them to stay in her village. As it turned out, she had very little gold, but she did have some pearls. She gave some of these pearls to the Spaniards as gifts. Later, however, De Soto arrested the Lady of Cofetachequi, held her hostage, and marched on. We cannot be certain what happened to the Lady of Cofetachequi, but according to some historians, she stayed with them for a time, and one day, when De Soto and his men were not looking, she took her opportunity to escape through the woods. Unfamiliar with the land, the Spaniards could not track the Lady Cofetachequi down, and they never saw her again. De Soto and his men went on a trek north and west through what is now Georgia and South Carolina, to the edge of the Blue Ridge Mountains. They passed through territory controlled by the Mississippians. Everywhere they went, they looked for gold, but had very little success. The De Soto expedition eventually reached the area now known as Alabama, where De Soto and his men fought one of their biggest battles. They killed more than 2,000 Mississippians. Only 22 of De Soto's men were killed, but about 200 were injured, including De Soto himself. The Spanish also lost many of their horses. By November of 1540, the De Soto expedition had entered into Mississippian territory in northeastern Mississippi. They spent the winter in an abandoned native village. Eventually, the Mississippians attacked, firing flaming arrows. The Spanish escaped only because their stampeding horses scared off the attacking natives. With all of the constant marching and fighting they were experiencing, De Soto's men grew very tired and were ready to go home. They became convinced that there was very little gold to be found in these parts of America. Some of them began to plan a mutiny against De Soto. De Soto, however, did not want to give up and go home empty-handed. He pushed his men on. They marched and fought their way west. In May of 1541, they reached the mighty Mississippi River. De Soto and his men did not let that stop them. They constructed makeshift flatboats and, under the cover of night to hide from the attacking natives, used the boats to ferry the men and the horses across the wide river. After De Soto and his men crossed the Mississippi River, they explored what is now Arkansas. Near what is now Camden, Arkansas, they met natives who lived in teepees and hunted buffalo. De Soto decided to spend the winter there. By the spring of 1542, even De Soto was becoming demoralized. De Soto had found almost no gold. He had lost many of his men, and his horses could barely walk. His translator, Juan Ortiz, had died, and the other translators were having trouble understanding the local natives. All of these terrible events together became the last straw. De Soto came down with a bad fever. He spent his days in bed, but the fever got worse. De Soto died on May 21st, 1542. His men attached stones to his body and tossed it into the Mississippi River. According to legend, because De Soto had told the Native Americans he was immortal or able to live forever, his men sank his body in the Mississippi River so that the Native Americans would not discover De Soto's body and realize this was a lie. The remaining men of the De Soto expedition made their way back to the Gulf of Mexico, where they built 7 boats. In July of 1543, they floated along the Gulf Coast past Texas and eventually made their way back to the Spanish outposts in Mexico. Throughout this difficult journey, the men on the De Soto expedition were the first known Europeans to explore the southeastern United States north and west of present-day Florida. All right, now you know about Hernando de Soto.